Welcome to the Pharmacy Inspection Podcast, where we discuss topics related to sterile and non-sterile compounding pharmacy in an effort to promote compliance and increase quality. The Pharmacy Inspection Podcast is a member of the Pharmacy Podcast Network, delivering quality and meaningful conversations and discussions about our pharmacy industry and the critical role pharmacists play in our healthcare systems. Learn more at pharmacypodcast.com. Please welcome your hosts, Bryan Prince and Seth DePasquale.
Hello and welcome to all of our compounding friends and colleagues, and welcome to episode 16 of the Pharmacy Inspection Podcast. My name is Bryan Prince, and I'm a compounding workflow consultant and lab designer specializing in USP-compliant environments. My co-host on this journey is Seth DePasquale, who co-owns and operates BET Farm, a compounding pharmacy specializing in equine reproduction. He's also the brains behind this podcast and the pharmacyinspection.com website, where he blogs about important issues in our industry. So this week, Seth and I are going to carry on a conversation we had earlier this week, and we thought to ourselves, this would be a really great debate to have over a podcast. And so it circles around the PPE process around a hazardous sterile suite. And the way that this kind of kicked off is that I think that we agree that once you walk inside of the ante room, we would put on double shoe booties immediately inside of a line of demarcation, or if you've got two different tones of heat welded vinyl flooring, which I'm a huge fan of. I think that if you're teaching technicians that donning and doffing of primary and secondary PPE should happen in different places, that a good way to do that is with, in fact, two different colors of heat welded vinyl flooring. That color differentiation, of course, gives them a delineation of where they should don and doff. So we're going to put on the two sets of shoe booties per USP 800 inside of our positive pressured anti-space just before, of course, going into the final buffer. At that point, we're also going to put on, we're going to go dirtiest to cleanest. We all agree on that. So we're going to go our hairnet, our mask, if we're, we need beard or you've got a mustache or any type of facial hair. And then we're going to go into hand hygiene. From hand hygiene, of course, then we're going to do gowns. And where some of the debate came in is whether or not it should be a single gown or a double gown. And we'll kind of get into that a little bit. So let's just say, for the sake of Brian's argument, we're going to quote unquote double gown. And I'll get into the reason why. Then we're going to we're actually going to introduce ourselves into the buffer. And if I miss any steps here, I'll let Seth kind of fill in the gaps. So once we are actually inside of that, we may or may not have on, I'm assuming at that point, prior to going into the buffer, we've actually got on a primary set of gloves. USP 800 says we have to do double gloving. I think that the second outer pair of chemo gloves need not actually be introduced until we're ready to introduce ourselves into the CPEC, which in this case will be a class 2 A2 type hood. That way we're getting both personnel and product protection from whatever we're compounding. So we go into the BSC at this point. Again, I've got on my outer set of gloves. So I've got on two sets of gloves, two sets of gowns, two sets of shoe booties, and then I do my compounding. Before I come out of that biological safety cabinet, I'm actually going to doff the outer set of chemo gloves and leave those inside of a dirty trash, whether it's a bag or some sort of just other disposal method, actually inside the hood. I don't want to bring out dirty chemo gloves outside the biological safety cabinet. So I've left those in. Now, as I'm coming out of the buffer, here's where I would doff. And again, I've had multiple discussions over this because this is one of those confusing areas that USP 800 actually does not address. So Brenda, Bill Mixon, Joe Caballero, Rad Dillon, all of our previous week's guests, we've all had conversations around this. And so we're kind of at somewhat of a consensus that after compounding, we're going to doff that outer gown. And that way we're left with a clean primary gown, because if in fact that outer gown was splashed or somehow contaminated inside of a hazardous drug buffer, inside of that negative suite, we don't then want to carry out that PPE into a positive pressure anti-space or prep room, whatever your layout design is, because then that's counterintuitive, because in my mind, you've then given that opportunity, that contamination to be introduced back into the facility, because the anti-room is positive pressure to other spaces, be it a hallway or a 795 room or wherever that outer space is. So we're going to doff inside of the negative pressure hazardous buffer. We're going to doff that outer gown. We're probably going to also doff the hair and the mask and the outer shoe booties. So then I'm left with a primary set of gloves as well as a gown. And then I'm going to introduce myself back into the ante room. So, Seth, I think you and I had a little bit of a gentleman's disagreement, because you weren't thinking that maybe the doffing component need to happen inside of that negative buffer for hazardous drugs. Am I right or am I wrong here?
Yeah, and I think that's really just my personal opinion, and it has to do with the microbiological contamination component of everything that we think about. And I know we've in weeks past even talked about, a safe procedure or process is a quality process. So I guess what I need to walk through is to understand, like, I can't wrap my head around like a workflow basically to try to mitigate as much as possible if we're going to doff in the buffer room, keeping overall particle counts down and any kind of contamination, because there's two sides to that coin. For sure, you don't want to contaminate your product, and I don't like that it's on a pendulum of and I guess maybe this is just in my head, a pendulum swinging between keeping your compounds free from contamination versus contaminating your personnel with any kind of hazardous chemicals or whatever. So maybe it's just that we need to like talk through a workflow that would be the most ideal for this whole situation. Do you have a workflow in mind that, because you just kind of did walk through, like, you don't want to take your gloves out of the BSC, so you'd bring in a bag or whatever to dispose of them and then bring them out of the BSC, so a Ziploc bag. How would you treat the rest of your PPE at that point then?
Right. So I guess let's just talk for a moment about contaminating the product. The product, in my mind, at that point, when I start to doff my PPE, the product itself, let's say it's a sterile filled syringe of whatever, an HRT, a T injectable, whatever it is, it's in its final component and it's a finished good. In my mind, let's just say theoretically, the technician was not wearing a double gown, because some pharmacists are going to be like, Bryan, do you understand how much more money I've got to spend with PPE now? And now you're asking me to double gown. Okay, I get that. So let's say that they don't. And they do, in fact, doff that gown before they go out of the negative hazardous suite. And they're left with exposed skin, which we all know in a sterile suite is a no-no, because your particle counts could go up because, dead skin cells are, constantly shedding off of us all the time. But in my mind, there's nothing that you could really do to generate a contamination that's going to find its way into the syringe, into the final prep, that is going to contaminate the product, because everything was prepped, filtered, filled, and done inside of the biological safety cabinet, which is the ISO 5 environment. And so it got, that prep got first air. It's then stoppered. It's got a septum. It's got it, again, it's in its final prep form. So I don't understand how you could really contaminate a final product. So you agree or disagree with that method?
Yeah, I would definitely agree with that. As long as, everything's basically stoppered up, sealed, virtually no no risk of contamination at that point. And I just kind of thought of the fact that, all right, so your room is going to be changing over air so many times per hour between the time you leave that room and probably the next time you come back into it, maybe even even just an hour later, your room will have had to change over at least 30 times anyway. But in some cases, that may even be like an entire day. So, 30 multiplied by 24, or even 20, that's quite a few air changes between. So I suppose the room would definitely be cleared out by then from any previous compounding procedure. So, all right, I'm down with that. I can see where you're going with that.
Yeah, and so let me just kind of justify also that double gowning, because I think that's going to be one of the bigger points of contention. Is that primary gown is coming out essentially clean because I've doffed that outer gown. Again, we just established that, okay, we never want to see exposed skin in a sterile room, whether it's a 797 or whether it's an 800, buffer. We never want to see exposed skin. So that's the reason for the primary. So in theory, that gown would not necessarily at that point have to be the primary gown, the gown that was not exposed to that outer air. It would not, in theory, have to be thrown away at that point, especially if you've got other preparations that need to happen. Maybe you're back in the ISO 8 prep room and you're doing other things. So again, in my mind, if I've got, in theory, a clean gown, which was the primary gown, which was the first gown I put on, then I can continue to use that. So I guess, and I'm going to toss that out because I don't want to kind of overstep my boundaries here because I don't work in a clean room. You do, Seth. So what do you think about that primary gown, in theory, not being contaminated and continuing on to do other preparations?
Realistically, if I'm thinking about putting on two different gowns from an employee operator comfort perspective, a lot of times we're in these rooms and they're temperature controlled, but they're, how well temperature controlled is debatable. To get to the points that we need to be at for a level of comfort, just to have one gown on, you should probably really be, at least for me, like I'd like to be in like a 65-degree room or 66-degree room. You're putting on double that is made up of some type of material that's going to protect you from spills of any kind of hazardous materials. It's probably a unique material in and of itself, but it also may not breathe so well either. I don't know. I suppose it depends on the material, but I would think that realistically, you'd have to have temperatures down to like 62 degrees for this guy to get into the clean room and put on double gowns. And I suppose the other thing is that, are we talking about a bunny suit? Or are we talking about like just a wraparound kind of gown that ties in the back, like kind of USP 800 recommends? So it depends. But here's the one thing I do know is that, like, if people are hot in a clean room or uncomfortable in the clean room, they're going to rush. And when you rush, your potential for making a mistake definitely goes up. And whether you catch that mistake, I suppose that all depends on what state of mind you're in. But when I get when I get hot and uncomfortable, I'm just like, oh my God, I gotta get out of here. So I think there's some unanswered questions there that I suppose would have to kind of come into play for that to be totally feasible.
Absolutely. You definitely, I think if you just probably hit for me the biggest part of it, because you and we always talk about quality. And if you've got a technician that is rushing to get in and out of a clean room because they are uncomfortable, then we've got the opportunity. And so just for the knowledge of the audience that is listening, because people probably are hearing this for the first time going, wait a minute, double gowning, is that part of the chapter? No, it is not part of the chapter. The only double garb that is called out in USP 800 is double shoe booties and double gloves. Double gowns was a theory that came out of a hazardous drug consensus group that I was part of with other consultants. And so we got to thinking, okay, if you've only got one rear tying gown, and we're not talking about the Tyvek bunny suits at this point, then, how does that affect the doffing and then the exposed skin, which was the point we were making earlier. But I think, Seth, you just really hit an important point, is that we don't want our technicians. People are going to be people, right? Sometimes some mornings we wake up, we trip over the cat, we can't get the kids off on the school bus, and and employees didn't show up for work, and can't find my favorite ballpoint pen. Life happens, right? And so on any given day, us being humans, we have a tendency to make mistakes. Maybe not you, Seth, but I have a tendency to make a lot of mistakes just because that's kind of how my brain works in a really non-linear fashion. So you made a great point. Does overdoing the PPE then cause employee discomfort, and does employee discomfort then create a chain reaction to problems? Am I reading the decimal place instead of 0.5, I read 0.05, or vice versa? Lord forbid it was vice versa. And I got the formulation all wrong. So people is the big part of the process in my mind. So I think we could probably continue to have this debate as, where is sensibility, where is comfort, where is safety, where is process? But again, in USP 800, the chapter itself, it does not call out for double gowning. In my mind, I just don't want to see a potentially contaminated gown coming out of a negative pressure buffer into a positively pressured environment, being the ante or a prep room or whatever that next space is for you. So that's kind of my big point there.
Yeah. I think, that is the line of delineation there. It kind of comes down to teetering on that line between employee personnel comfort and quality and quality of your compound. And it's a tough line to teeter on. So I don't know what the answer is. I don't know. I think that's an interesting thing, though. I think if there's any way that I could kind of wrap my head around, just totally ungarbing or doffing in your buffer room, that would be the absolute probably best way to do it. But like I said before, I think that given the amount of air changes per hour, I think we can really safely assume that the room's going to change over so many times, and we're probably going to be okay, to be honest with you. So
yeah, absolutely. And so 30 air changes has always been really the design minimum for a sterile buffer suite. So I would caution anybody out there that is now currently working with an architect, an engineering firm, a mechanical engineer, an HVAC engineer, whatever the title is of the person that you're working with, to make sure that you get the design component right of your sterile suite. Design at 45 to 60 air changes per hour, because we get into the people, the process, the heat. Imagine if somebody is in fact double gowned, they may be sweating, they may be letting off more heat with their body, they're perspiring more. And so all of these things, the equipment, the people, the process, and all of those things that are happening create a heat gain with inside of that room. And so if the room is designed at its minimal spec of 30 air changes per hour, and I've heard this time and time again, that room may end up failing under a dynamic working condition because it cannot maintain 68 degrees and the correct percentage of particles, the correct percent, the relative humidity, all of those targets that we have to certify and balance towards that. The dynamic component is a big deal. So never design to just 30 air changes per hour. You design above that, and that's a little bit of a sweet spot or a buffer or a give me or whatever other word you want to toss into that mix.
So you did mention, though, taking off the mask and hair cover inside the buffer. What about that? Because that would be some of the parts of a person that probably would shed just a whole bunch of particles. Where do you feel like that falls when we're talking about hazardous drugs, contamination, microbial versus hazardous personnel contamination? What are your thoughts there?
Yeah, great point. I probably did step on my tongue there, which is not surprising for me. So if I would say probably do not take off your hairnet. The biggest concern is if anything was potentially contaminated or dirty inside of the hazardous, whatever that is. They'll say occasionally the technician will have the proverbial nose itch, and what happens to their hands that they go to deal with that proverbial nose itch. But it is still very unlikely that a hairnet itself was, in fact, contaminated. So I guess my synopsis would be it is very unlikely that a hair bouffant is going to get contaminated. So therefore, I'm going to drop back and say, no, that actually could be introduced back into the positive pressure anti-space where it will then be doffed properly there. As for a face mask, I would say unless there is the proverbial nose itch or something like that, it's very unlikely that probably, and I would never really want somebody to take that off. So that particular PPE, which is really kind of, higher up on the body, yes, I would take that and I would doff that inside of the positively pressured anti-space. So hopefully I haven't confused the audience too much to say what is donned and what is doffed in what spaces. And if so, we always encourage our audience to engage with us on the website, pharmacyinspection.com. You can actually either leave us a voicemail or leave us a comment, and we will certainly clarify it because, again, this is always a lot to take in. It's always a lot for me to take in. And I've always kind of admittedly shied away a little bit from sterile. When I tell people that I feel more comfortable in a non-sterile environment where they're handling heavy amounts of powder, they're doing encapsulation, that workflow side for me, I'm very comfortable over there. But the sterile side, I've always kind of shied away, but I've had to delve more and more into it. So it is not always the easiest concepts to pick up and run with. So audience, engage with us. We'll certainly clarify anything that's confusing.
Yeah, absolutely. And, I'd mentioned at the end of last week's podcast that I was going to set up a little bit of a forum for this whole topic and discussion. And so you can find that under the forums section of the site. But of course, if you just want to engage via email, feel free to email us at podcast@pharmacyinspection.com or any of the other things that Bryan had mentioned. So yeah, this is definitely one of those topics that just is a little confusing to everybody. and I don't think it's the discussion's totally over yet, to be honest with you, because I think today in the hazardous consensus group brings up some good points. So to be continued.
Yeah. And again, I know that we promised you this incredible, lively debate, and maybe it was or maybe it wasn't, but let's kind of lead down a path where I don't expect it to be as much of a debate as it would be for me to be a learning experience. And so I mentioned earlier that I'm more comfortable in the non-sterile area where they're handling heavy amounts of powder. And so further into the USP 800 chapter, we get into section 15, which is deactivating, decontaminating, cleaning, and disinfecting. For a lot of these independent community pharmacies that are out there and they're doing non-sterile compounding only, they don't even venture into the sterile side because, number one, they don't want the hassle and worry about the FDA and all of the other things that are kind of as a stigma to sterile compounding. So they stay in the non-sterile realm. That whole deactivating, decontaminating, cleaning, and disinfecting concept is maybe a little bit elusive. And it is for me as well, because in years past when I was in containment technology, people would say, what's the proper way to clean a powder hood? Well, interesting enough, it's front to back versus back to front. In old chem days when we were cleaning the biological safety cabinets or large fume hoods, they would teach us actually clean them back to front. But with a powder hood, with a class 1 powder hood, we would clean them front to back. That we're raking the powder with the airflow because it's a negative pressure environment. So therefore, any of those particulates would be captured. But the point is we were doing that basically with 70-30 IPA. Right. So standard isopropyl alcohol was really the end all be all for us doing basically deactivating, contaminating, cleaning, whether or not we called it all of those things. And so, Seth, I got to ask you, because you're probably a lot more knowledgeable on this topic here recently, because I know you've delved into it as well as a research project. How do you see this being handled in an 800 non-sterile environment, heavy HRT, heavy powder, those type of environments?
Let's stop right there and pick up on that conversation in a future episode. We'll be getting back to this question because, like we said, these are topics that seem to be not completely cut and dry and maybe have some interpretation wiggle room, so to speak. Next week, we're going to have Erica Fallon of Fallon's Wellness Pharmacy in Latham, New York. Erica and I went to the same college of pharmacy a few years apart, and we've gotten to know each other quite a bit over the last year or so. Her family owns basically the only compounding pharmacy in the area where we're from, and she's heavily involved within the regulatory side of compounding pharmacy through her association with IACP. If you're looking to learn more about the legislative and regulatory side of compounding, you're not going to want to miss this next one. Thanks for joining us this week and every week on the podcast. We really appreciate you listening and hope you, the listener, is getting as much out of this as we are. Is there a topic or guest you'd like to hear? Let me know. Email me at podcast@pharmacyInspection.com or tweet @pharmacyinspect. And a special thank you to all those who joined me on the Compounder's Guide to Environmental Monitoring webinar through the ACVP. I had a great time and really enjoyed answering the questions you guys had. If you just have a general question about compounding or want to strike up a conversation with Bryan or I, please feel free to reach out to us. Honestly, this is what we live for and love to talk about. So until next week, keep raising the bar.